Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, most MPs can show you in their constituencies where there are rotting floors, outdated buildings and broken potholes. Some may even have made a website about it. But the truth is, this is no laughing matter. We know our schools in this country are falling apart, that investment in our education buildings is 18% lower in 2014 than it was in 2009. Britain is now ranked 24th by the World Economic Forum for the quality of its infrastructure, down from 19th in 2006. And we can't see this getting any better. Indeed, spending on infrastructure has nosedived since Brexit. Now, whatever some may say about fixing these problems, all of it has to be paid for. And governments of all persuasions, including the previous Labour government, as well as this one, have used private finance to build. It's the equivalent of getting a mortgage or even remortgaging your home to pay for a new roof or an extension. Crucially, in these deficit-denying times, it's seductive not only because it spreads payments for new schools, hospitals and stations and their management over decades or more, it keeps them off the books.
Did the Honourable Lady give way?
Yes, absolutely.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way and for giving me the chance to make a comment about Northern Ireland. In Northern Ireland, in a report issued in 2014 for some 39 PFI projects, a staggering 7.3 billion is the apparent total cost of that there for the maintenance, etc. Does the Honourable Lady agree with me that any thought for PFI must be an absolute last resort and indeed should only be permissible in very extreme need?
I hope in my speech to convince the gentleman that there may be many alternatives to PFI, because the question for us is at what cost have we done this borrowing? We now pay £10 billion a year in PFI repayments, equating to £3,400 for every man, woman and child in Britain. These projects are worth £57 billion, but we are committed to paying back £232 billion by 2050. Now, it's clear that PFI has addressed some of the project management issues we had in the public sector that made it so bad at building. As the National Audit Office highlight, it has dramatically cut late delivery of projects and overspending on buildings. But as the Treasury Select Committee points out, it is suboptimal value for money. One hospital was charged £52,000 to demolish a £750 shelter for smokers. A school had to pay £302 for a plug socket to be replaced, 5 times the cost of the equipment it wanted to plug into it. And in my constituency of Walthamstow, we have seen firsthand the damage done. My local hospital, Whipps Cross, is part of the Barts Health Foundation, which has the largest UK PFI deal made at £1.1 billion. By 2049, the amount paid back will be £7 billion. Last year alone, the Trust shelled out £148 million, equivalent to the salaries of 6,000 nurses, of which half was the interest paid on the loan at all. Their deficit of £90 million has led managers to downgrade nursing posts. Little wonder the CQC placed my local hospital into special measures, as the quality of their care declined. Now, the Minister, I've no doubt, will say his government has reviewed PFI, that they have made cuts to these costs, renegotiating to buy fewer light bulbs, less cleaning, saving us a whole £1.6 billion out of that £220 billion. But as the NEO has pointed out, no one has really considered whether private finance itself is value for money. So tonight I want to ask 3 very simple questions. Whether the terms of PFI, the rates we pay to borrow this way, are the best that we as taxpayers can get to build such schools and hospitals. Whether even now we can save money on the costly deals that have been signed by governments of all persuasions and which are draining our public services of much needed money. And above all, whether government is doing enough to secure the competition for our business as taxpayers. Of course, it's hard to answer these questions without the data about what we're paying, something I know the government doesn't have because I have asked. That's why I tried asking all the hospitals around the country to find out what rate they were paying, because on the 8th of February this year, the Treasury ministers told me they don't hold this data centrally. Now, most NHS trusts refused to disclose this information, claiming it was commercially sensitive. But those who did were very revealing. It showed that in December 1994, under John Major's government, 2 PFIs in Durham, one for the Dryburn District Hospital and one for Bishop Auckland General Hospital, had rates of 15% and 18% respectively. For comparison, the 10-year gilt rate at the same time was just over 8%. In December 2002, The Crosshouse Maternity Hospital in Kilmarnock was at 16%, whilst a month later the Edmonton Acute Services was rated at 14%. The gilt rate then was 4.6%. And in March 2010, the Leeds Wellbeing Centre offered a return of 14%. The Liverpool University Hospital redevelopment, 11%. And again, the long-term gilt rate was 4.2%. Now, I know some may argue that you can't make direct comparisons with gilt rates, so let me flag up that at the same time, the equity returns on the stock market for the last 30 years have averaged 5 to 6% per annum. So it's very clear that PFI investors have got a great rate, and that isn't by accident. Critically, research from Edinburgh University shows that these rates don't vary as other premiums would in our financial markets, that they stay well above the cost of other forms of funding. So public bodies may well full know these premiums are high, but if that's the return the market expects for managing these projects, and there is no alternative, there is not much they can do without the government's help. We should also point out that these are the rates which were made when the contracts were signed. As we now know, much profit has been made by reselling on these debts. The South London NHS Trust, which collapsed, had 2 large PFI contracts, one of which was offering investors annual returns of 71%. Most PFI contracts were let on an expectation of that already high 15 to 17%, but refinancing has seen some returns to investors raise over 70%. Now, in 2007, a new standard clause was issued to allow authorities to request this financial information and track the kind of returns that investors were creating. However, there's little evidence that anyone has used that contract clause or indeed the government has promoted it. So it's hard for us to see just how much taxpayers' money is being recycled into higher payments for investment funds, not infrastructure for the UK. Again, no central database exists. But if we don't know what we are paying, we do know who we're paying, and often it's the same companies. 45% of projects were funded by the same people. Firms such as Dalmore Capital, Semperian, Kojima, Innisfree, Barclays crop up time and time again, often investing together too. This dominance by a small group of companies matters because this government is continuing to use their services in its proposed replacement to PFI, PF2. Now, PF2 separates out the service element, the building management, from the capital, the building of it. So far, so good. Those light bulbs may be replaced after all if the cost of them isn't connected to the cost of building schools. But PF2 is supposed to get more long-term investors through increasing the requirement for equity, the most expensive bit of the deal, potentially making it even more expensive to the public purse than PFI. It also expects us as taxpayers to take on more of this too. Not enough to be in charge of the project, but more to cover the cost. So it's not that different to PFI. It's still about us borrowing money from private companies to build things at rates that are not transparent or competitive to the alternative sources of funding that we could raise. So that question is, are there better ways to borrow? Certainly the calculations used by the government in the Green Book to compare the costs of these deals with the public sector have not made that easier to answer. It set the value of public sector borrowing at 3.5% real and 6% nominal since 2003. This is despite the cost of public borrowing being well below that for over a decade. Indeed, the Treasury Select Committee has suggested that the government review the Green Book, but it's not clear that the government has heard that message. So will the Minister tell us if PF2 is using the same calculations at PFI just at the very time when the cost of borrowing to the public sector is even lower? The Green Book also includes the shadow price of tax, the money private companies will pay in tax in the UK as a result of getting this business. That money is set against the cost of borrowing from these companies to decide if the deal is better than doing it for the public sector. Now, the lack of information about these projects means the government is simply not able to verify whether those presumptions about tax are accurate, and the NAO's evidence suggests not. The companies themselves continue to be cited overseas. Innisfree is cited in Guernsey, so is Paleo. Semperian is registered in Jersey. PF2 will do nothing to tackle this, or indeed stop the resale of shares in these deals, which take advantage of the fact that governments don't default to make more money. What does the Minister make of the bosses of the Sandwell and West Birmingham Hospital Trust, who admitted they could not stop Carillion, investors in the PF2 for the Midland Metropolitan Hospital, from selling on their equity investment to generate the kind of profits, again, that we saw under PFI? At a time when huge spending cuts are being threatened, when the NHS is facing a financial shortfall of £20 billion by 2020 alone, To continue to pay inflated rates to rich investors is to continue to ignore these problems. Indeed, a quarter of single-tier and county councils are now spending the equivalent of 10% of their revenue on debt servicing alone. So the answer to our first question is no. These private deals aren't always a good deal. Then we need to ask the second question. If we can't get out of them, can we renegotiate? Can we consolidate to reduce the repayments and put the savings back into frontline services? Sadly, to date, only Northumbria Hospital has done this, and only at great expense to the council there and with minimal savings. Imagine the savings that could have been achieved if the government had negotiated on a group of these contracts with these companies at the same time. Interest that could be saved could be paying down debt or paying teachers and nurses properly. So then we face our final question. Why are we only borrowing from these companies? Why aren't more competing for our business as taxpayers? In the last few years, this government has been making it harder for local government to pay down its debts. The Public Works Loan Board could use the government's financial strength as a borrower to secure much lower rates and pass it on to these public bodies. Instead, in 2007, it changed the early repayment terms, and in 2010, it made changes to loans to make it harder, not easier, for local councils to borrow efficiently. If that doesn't excite ministers, then maybe they will support an alternative in the shape of the new municipal bond agency local councils are creating. They are seeking to lend at margins of between 0.6 to 1% over the underlying government funding rate. Because currently, if a council wants to borrow money for 30 years from the Public Loans Board, it will charge just over 2%. And in contrast to the complexity of PFI, or PF2, municipal bonds are simple and transparent, issuing bonds to the market to raise funds and lending to local government at a fixed rate. Or the government could make pension funds more likely to invest in partnership with government by being more transparent about these deals and the returns to be made. We know that the current pension infrastructure platform has simply led to these companies buying old PFI debt. But we know that can change. Manchester and London local government pension funds have recently acted together to invest in wind farms and biomass. There's clearly a market for this. With government support, this could be the basis for a UK sovereign wealth fund, the people's money used for the people's projects. But the sad truth is none of these innovations are coming from this House or from HM Treasury. So the question has to be asked, why are we throwing good money after bad, trying to make private finance initiatives work? With a Prime Minister who's pledged to put infrastructure investment at the heart of this post-Brexit economy, Britain can't afford to keep making these expensive mistakes. So I have 5 simple questions for the Minister. 1. Will he commit to publishing the rates public agencies are borrowing at so we can have greater transparency of the costs incurred to the taxpayer? So we can check, as many fear, whether PF2 is indeed going to be more expensive than PFI. Just when will the government publish the equity returns data on those PFI deals that we've been promised since last year? 2. Is the Minister not perturbed by the relationships between a small group of institutional investors in these deals and the lack of competition for taxpayers' business? And if so, will he ask the Competition and Markets Authority, who act on behalf of consumers, and as taxpayers we are consumers, to review this sector and explore whether barriers to new entrants exist? Thirdly, will the government step in to help public bodies saddled with these PFI and indeed PF2 contracts to renegotiate these debts and get the costs down to save that money for frontline services? 4. Will the government rewrite the Green Book to reflect the real costs and benefits of public borrowing versus private borrowing? 5. What does the Minister make of the new Eurostat rules published in March, which consider such equity stakes as the government is intending us to take out in PF2 to be direct financing and so be on the books? Doesn't that undermine the point of PF2 in the first place? And 5. How will he stop money simply going overseas into tax havens to higher profits for private companies, not public services for the people? As things stand, 46 schools will be built using £700 million of that PF2 control total, and many more hospitals, at a time when borrowing for the government is an exceptionally low cost. But don't take my word for it. Take the words of Leo McQuinn, the chief executive of Balfour Beatty, who recently said, "Money is effectively free." There is no excuse not to act, to tackle the costs of existing private finance contracts and take on the lack of competition for our business as taxpayers so that we can really get value for money. so that instead of injecting our cash into profits for private companies overseas, we can inject our money into the kind of projects that will get Britain's economy and Britain's people back into business.
Minister Kirby.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Let me start by thanking the Honourable Member for Walthamstow for securing the debate here today. How we go about funding the infrastructure this country needs is a topic of huge importance, and I know members across the House will join me in thanking her for this opportunity to discuss it today. Because we all share a desire to make sure we fund our public services in the very best way possible, we're talking about schools, the hospitals people rely on, the roads, the train lines, the energy supplies, the broadband coverage. In short, the public services that not only keep our economy running, but help us generate new jobs and new opportunities for people across the country. And as someone who has run a number of businesses and now finds himself as a minister at the Treasury, what I don't want to see is money wasted. So my priority, and that of my colleagues in government, is to make sure that when we invest in the services people need, we get a good outcome and we pay a good price. And clearly, teaming up with the private sector can be an important way to finance new projects in the most efficient way possible. Because often these are complex, difficult projects which come with a range of risks to delivering them successfully on time and on budget. And one of the benefits that the private finance initiative brought was to move the risks associated with construction and delivering these projects to the private sector, who were best placed to manage them. For us, that means not only if something goes wrong, it is the responsibility of the private sector partners to fix it. But it also means that we only pay if the service is working and available for use. As such, partnerships between the public and private sectors can be the best way to find the best value for the taxpayer. And we are clear that we will only enter into public-private partnerships where the evidence shows us that this is the case. We've also done a lot of work to make sure that the system is financing projects privately is as effective as possible. The primary model used for around 2 decades was, of course, the private finance initiative. And while in many cases this was an effective way to deliver new infrastructure, it wasn't always the case that projects went smoothly. And not all of those partnerships deliver the kind of value for money we would all want to see. And that's why, under the last government, we did a lot of work to tackle that. We looked at what lessons could be drawn from the PFI and how we could keep the best parts of it while making important reforms. This culminated in the 2012 launch of a new model of how public-private partnerships could work, Private Finance 2. This helped iron out a variety of issues. For example, the private financial initiative was often criticised for its long procurement times, which could sometimes last for many years. PF2 has already been shown to deliver shorter procurement times and has already delivered almost 50 schools and a hospital project. Under the new system, we have taken also important measures to improve transparency, from the annual publication of data to the Treasury's involvement on the boards of the companies leading the projects. And we've listened to the feedback from stakeholders to build in more flexibility to the standard contracts we used, which often dictated services such as cleaning and catering. These have now been removed so the public sector have a greater say over how the services they use are run. We have not just improved the overall system for new projects going forward as well. We have to bear in mind, Mr Deputy Speaker, that we have a legacy of over 700 projects that originated under the Private Finance Initiative, together worth around £60 billion in terms of capital investment. 639 of these had reached financial close before May 2010. We want to make sure we are doing what we can to make sure these projects run as efficiently as possible. And in 2011, we launched a programme to deliver an initial 1.5 billion of savings and efficiencies. We look at PFI projects across sectors, from health to education, justice to transport. And I'm pleased to say that of March last year, public sector organisations from across local and central government have reported more than £2 billion of savings and efficiencies over the life of the projects. We are still exploring a potential further £2 billion in savings through the more efficient use of facilities and adjustments to the scope of contracts. And even where, I will give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way. He just said there that the government is still exploring the ability to make further savings to the scope of the contracts. Can he confirm if the government is looking at the rates of return paid on these contracts and whether there are opportunities to negotiate with the companies that own these contracts, many of them across the country, to reduce the repayments of interest on them collectively, to consolidate some of these loans to the public sector?
I think what I can say is that the government is prepared to look at all of these individual arrangements to look at where it's possible to obtain the best value for money. Often, and in many of the cases, it is simply not possible to restructure or to pay off the debt in a way that's value for money for the taxpayer. But we would be mad, would we not to be looking carefully about providing the best possible value for money, the best possible public services, and you know, that's something that's an ongoing thing. As I was saying, if it's not possible to find obvious savings as a project, we're working with departments and procuring authorities to improve day-to-day efficiencies and management of the contract. Now, the Honourable Lady mentioned a number of questions, and if I may, she asked about equity investments and equity returns. Public sector equity and shareholder loans committed to PF2 projects as of March 2016 totalled to 8.2 million. The Infrastructure and Projects Authority, IPA, on behalf of the Treasury, plans to collate the equity returns information over the course of this year. This will be the first collection of data, as the projects included are only now becoming operational and starting to make a return, and we've not currently set a date for publication, but we can expect it at an appropriate time in the future. The Honourable Lady asked about the Green Book. I can tell her there will be a refresh later this year. There will be a clear guidance to departments about the alternatives to PF2 and whether that particular form of finance is the most appropriate. The Honourable Lady mentioned value for money. To be clear, the government will only use public-private partnerships such as PF2 to deliver a project where it provides value for money over a publicly financed solution. Analysis is carried out using the principles in the Green Book published by the Treasury. On that point,
giving way. Obviously, one of the issues here is whether there is effective competition for our business as consumers. Can I push him? I did ask whether he would ask the Competition and Markets Authority to review that very point so that there may be more options, there may be more alternatives, or we may understand why there are barriers to alternatives. Will he agree to that? And could he just clarify when he says the appropriate time for those equity returns data? Obviously, we have been promised that now for over 18 months. Can he guarantee that perhaps it might be an early Christmas present at the very least?
Well, I can certainly guarantee that it is as soon as possible. The thing is, you need the data to be able to report on it. Most of these projects are only just starting, so you know, I'm sure we can have it as soon as is reasonable. She mentions alternatives. I'm very fortunate in my constituency of Brighton Kemp Town to have a fantastic new hospital being built at nearly £500 million. It's not using PFI, it's not using PF2, it's using money. It's the Royal Sussex County Hospital. So each of these projects has different ways of being financed. It's about, at all times, for all projects, providing the best possible value for money for the taxpayer. I will.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My local hospital and that of the Honourable Member for Sherwood has one of the particularly egregious examples of PFI signed some time ago. But I think that is an example, alluding to what the Honourable Lady from Walthamstow described, of a hospital with a severe PFI which could be bought back and avoid some of the very inflated inflation and interest costs in the years to come. Would the Treasury seriously consider, in this age of incredibly low public borrowing, a 30-year bond, for example, to buy back the most egregious PFI debts, particularly in places like hospitals, where it has such a major effect on certain trusts like mine? That must be the way to secure best value for the taxpayer in the long term.
Well, I think my honourable friend raises a very interesting point. A lot of the finance projects are financed in different ways. If we look at the honourable lady opposite's local hospital, Whipps Cross, I believe she called it, which is part of the Barts Hospital PFI, that was a hospital project that was bond financed. Refinancings are far more difficult and are far less of a practical proposition for bank debt, and I think it's safe to say that refinancing of bonds is unlikely to deliver value for money. So it isn't only the value for money in how to finance new projects, also the value for money in whether it's possible to change or alter or vary an existing finance arrangement. It's quite... I will give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way. I'm pleased that he raises my local hospital because that is owned by Innisfree, which owns a huge number of these projects across the country. I'm not sure if it's the one in Sherwood. I believe actually some of the ones in Brighton Kent Town may actually have some connection to them. There is a case to be made about renegotiating with these companies who especially may wish to ask for PF2 or bid for PF2 business in the future. There is also the question, can I just press on this point about, is he satisfied there is enough competition for our business as taxpayers? Will he refer this to the Competition and Markets Authority so they can look at these issues? They can look at whether these companies have a captive market, whether some of those alternatives such as bonds or the pension funds might be willing to invest in these projects and help out these public services, as well as not make the same mistakes with PF2 that it looks like we're making that were made with PFI.
Well, I think for raising that question, I'm quite happy to reassure her and to give a commitment that I'm happy to look at any solution that provides value for money. If that means we should have more competition, then so be it. At the end of the day, we have a responsibility as a government to get the best possible value for money for the taxpayer. We are, in many cases, historically in a difficult position. Her hospital finance was 2006 off the top of my head. It is something that is very difficult to unwind. But if she's asking me whether it's my intention or our intention as a government to get the best possible deal, yes, clear it is. And if it were appropriate, after all the investigation and all considerations, to follow the route you suggest, that's certainly something I would consider. If I may move on slightly, how are we doing? If I may reiterate the fact that this is an important issue. It's an issue that there's a surprising agreement on all sides of the House. We all want to see the best possible public services. We all want to get the best possible deal for our constituents and the taxpayers who pay for these vital infrastructure projects. But it's about being realistic about what we can change that's happened in the past, and that doesn't mean that we should give up and we should accept that it isn't possible to provide a better deal. I would just like to say it's about achieving the best possible value always, because that's what the public expects, that's what the nation's finances need, and that's what I'll do my best, and this government will do its best to deliver.
The question is, this House do now adjourn. As many of that opinion say aye. The contrary no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order.